friends, my name is Maehrer, and today we're going to talk about the 10 worst books that I read in 2023. I read 125 books last year, and I mentioned when I did my best of the year video that it was kind of a mediocre reading year for me. I had high highs, low lows, and just a ton of 3 and 3.5 star rated reads, so it was really easy to identify the best things that I read last year, and equally as easy to identify the worst things that I read. Coming in at number 10 is once again a title from St. Martin's Press. Now, I thought about just telling you guys what it was because I personally don't feel like ripping this book apart is promotion for either the book or the imprint, but I know that people feel differently about like what is considered promotion. I approach my content in one way, but in the spirit of supporting the boycott and having another opportunity to tell you guys about it, I'll just say that my number 10 slot went to a book from St. Martin's Press. It is the least worst on this list for a number of like craft reasons. I will also say that I had a fun discussing this book in like the various ways that I did discuss it. So I think that maybe that puts it a little like rosier in my memory, but the book itself, very not good. Also not good is the way that St. Martin's Press has refused to further engage with influencers who are asking for some accountability on their behalf after one of their employees who works on their marketing team, who influencers would have contact with and would have to work with, was posting racist, violent, inflammatory things on their social media account. And essentially what we're asking for is not even anything to do with that employee who has not been identified by the boycott. What influencers were initially just asking for was some assurances that there was protections in place for the people who would have to work with this team, some assurances about the privacy of our information, the equity of their programs. If these are the ideals that are held by the people running the program, what are some things that you can share with us about how your programs are run equitably? Like really simple, basic requests. And St. Martin's Press' initial response to all of this was to dismiss these concerns and to outright lie to the person who brought them forward. So that's why we've moved to a marketing boycott. What we're asking for is for influencers, reviewers, not to feature titles under St. Martin's Press. You can still buy them, you can still read them, you can still talk about them with your friends. All that we're asking is that you stand in solidarity with the Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian members of our community, as well as all of the other BIPOC members of our community, as we ask for some assurances of safety here. Just please don't feature them on your channels. All of the information about the boycott will be linked in the description. So for now, all you need to know is that my 10th most hated book sucked, and it came from St. Martin's Press. Number 9 is The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. This is an adult fantasy romance about a human woman who is the adopted daughter of a vampire king. And so she grows up in this really violent and brutal environment where essentially everybody wants to kill her. And so her only way to become something more than just human and prey in this world is to enter this tournament that is being held by the goddess of death. As I go through this list, I will let you know like why I picked up the book, because some of these books I picked up for a project or for a specific reason, but some of them I just picked up because I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, or it had a lot of hype and I was curious, or something along those lines. Like I went into it for the purpose of a pleasant reading experience, and what I got was not that. And this was one of those books that I just picked up because like everybody was raving about this book, but in a way that sold me on it, because while it was being compared to other fantasy romance like ACOTAR and From Blood and Ash, like the whole thing that I was hearing was that this was in fact better, that was a little bit more mature, that it was better written, that had an amazing twist at the end, that the characters were better. So I was very curious, as somebody who should like fantasy romance, because fantasy and romance are like two of my favorite genres. They're the genres that I read the most. I was like, okay, let's try it. I am forever on the hunt for a good fantasy romance. And here we are on my worst of the year list. There are so many reasons why this did not work. I think at the heart of what is wrong with this book is that it is incredibly underdeveloped in all of its elements. I think that this falls into the trap of so many fantasy romances that I have read, where it like wants to do the romance so badly that it doesn't actually think about any of its fantasy elements. But it's also so distracted trying to do the fantasy elements that it also doesn't develop its romance particularly well. And so what you get is something that is weak as a fantasy and weak as a romance. And that was absolutely what happened here. This whole idea of like the games in the tournament, that this is a human girl being being raised amongst vampires, and she has to compete in this tournament for reasons. Like, none of that made sense. The really annoying thing was that, like, you start reading and the book itself is aware that, like, none of this makes sense, and it just goes on and on and on about how, like, she's probably gonna die because she's like, there's no way that she could possibly win against all these people that can kill her easily. And it's acknowledging it and saying it back to me as a reader so many times that I was like, you're right. Like, what are we doing here? I believe you. And that's how it starts. And from there, what you have is just an experience where you cannot question one single thing, or else this entire conceit will fall apart. All of the elements of the world are incredibly flat and underdeveloped. Like, it tells you some things about the different vampires, but mostly just kind of by naming it, like, there's this house and this house, but there isn't a good sense of the world. There isn't a good map of the world. There isn't a good scope of the world. And that is translated into the games itself. Like, why are we here? Where are we? I was even asking myself, like, in the middle of this, like, where is everyone? Because the world even felt underpopulated. Like, at points I was just like, have we seen another person? Like, and even when those side characters were being brought up and, like, we were checking in with them, they were so flat. I couldn't remember who anybody was. I had no idea why we were supposed to care about anybody, and it was just a big old boring time. The characters themselves are so tropey that it was difficult to invest in them. Like, if you had this kind of underdeveloped world and a game that didn't really make sense, but some standout characters, like, maybe that could have saved it some. But I didn't find that these characters stood out in any way. In fact, they were so incredibly tropey. The main character, we know, is sort of like detached from her own humanity, and there are some ways that she's like on this journey of self-discovery. So I get why she's being depicted as kind of flat, but even if I understand that sort of intellectually, from a reading experience perspective, you have a flat world and an undeveloped plot, and also like a main character who you're sitting in her first person perspective, who she's kind of detached from her own self. Like, that is not a pleasant reading experience. And she doesn't get a lot of personality. She's just like girl with knife, and that's like the extent of what we get from her. And then you have her love interest, who is just like so generic to every single winged, broody, bad boy who wears black, shadowy guy that you've ever read. That is him. There's absolutely nothing that distinguishes him as a character. This isn't helped by the fact that I found the dialogue incredibly stilted and sort of in service of just like hitting the beats of the trope, and the writing itself annoyed me, apart from not being very descriptive and not being good at giving me a picture of what was going on. It just also abused M dashes, and that means that it didn't have a great cadence. It added to that sort of stilted feeling of like how it kept interrupting itself. And it also did one of my biggest pet peeves in this like class of fantasy romance that we're getting, and it's like the overuse of a nickname. I hate a forced nickname even more, but the overuse of a nickname is like second. And her adopted dad calls her Serpent, and the love interest calls her Princess, and we get that over and over and over again. Ultimately, this was incredibly predictable, and because we don't have a good sense of the world or the games, it just felt like we were kind of stumbling around through a series of like loosely connected happenings that I could not follow a thread of this book or this plot. And then we just kind of ended up where you can still, despite all of that, guess where you will end up. The last thing I will say is that there was one sex scene in here, and it was bad, and it was even worse to listen to on audiobook. This was a single narrator who was doing like a really terrible voice for the main male character, and having to listen to her do that voice while saying the sexy bits, nightmare fuel. Number 8 is Assistant to the Villain by Nicole Maehrer. This is the story of a woman named Evie who is desperately seeking a job, and so she becomes an assistant to the villain, who is called the villain, and we watch their interactions together, and then someone starts sabotaging the villain, and they're trying to figure out who's doing that. If you guys have been following my content this year, you know this is the year that I made Red Tower, the imprint, my nemesis. So I've been paying a lot of attention this year to this new imprint, and specifically specifically to the works that are coming out of there, but also their approach, their marketing style, the quality of the books that are coming out of there, not only in terms of the story, but the physical quality as well, because a huge selling point of these Red Tower books is that they're like special edition books, like books you could get in a book box, but made more widely available. So Assistant to the Villain was the third Red Tower book that I attempted. And so at this point, I was going into them knowing that this was project reading. I very much did not have high hopes, specifically because it was coming from Red Tower, but I wasn't super familiar with like the book or the premise or the author. At some point during my reading, or when I was putting my review together, I found out more about the author, who actually has a pretty big following over on TikTok, and she grew that following by putting together a series of skits about a woman who was an assistant to the villain, and those skits were the basis for the premise of this book. I won't expose you guys to the skits again. If you're curious, I did a full review of this book and I will link that, but I won't do that. I won't do that to me again is really the point here. I do not want to be exposed to, I don't want to do that to editing me. I've seen enough. I saw what I needed to see, and what I saw was that like the humor there just fundamentally was never going to be for me. And it became such an unpleasant reading experience because there was only one joke. There was one singular joke throughout this entire book, and it was just like, ha ha ha, man who do murder so hot. And that was like the entire thing. There was barely any plot, barely any characterization for anyone involved, and this one singular joke was like doing its damnedest to string this all together into some sort of cohesive book. The lack of world building and the anachronisms that were fine for 60-second skits on TikTok were very much not okay in a book. The fact that we're in some place and he's the villain and it's sort of feudal and it's kind of magic, but it's also really modern, and she's wearing stilettos, and like all of those different pieces did not at all gel together. And it made it really apparent to me that while this was pulled from this source material, it wasn't actually developed enough to work cohesively as like a plot for a book. In addition to thinking that the humor and a lot of the banter was incredibly cringy, I think that this had a big time tone problem. Like, I don't think that this understood what it wanted to be. And in like making this one big joke about like murder so hot, it didn't consider anything else about like what it was saying and what it was presenting. And I understand that this is supposed to be funny and lighthearted, and I'm not asking for this to be like deep and nuanced, but it also just like kept bringing things up, like putting them in your face and then just letting them flop, sort of unanswered and unacknowledged. So if you create the situation where somebody has to support themselves by being an assistant to the villain, but you don't actually address anything about like good or evil or like capitalism or what it takes to survive or this man's weaponized incompetence or like, I don't know, any of that. You just kind of like show it to us and then like walk away to go do the same joke again about how Murder Man is so hot. Like, that created such a frustrating reading experience to me. It was so shallow. It was like this book was forcing me to sit in a shallow puddle. and I hated that for me personally. The tone problem extends to the fact that it didn't quite commit to whether or not this villain was like misunderstood, right? Like, it appears he is doing evil things, but he has his reasons, he has his own sense of morality, and that's kind of what justifies her being able to contribute to that, because there's like some other layer there that is like complicated, complex in terms of his morality. It started to do some of that, but it didn't quite go that direction, because then we just had all of this casual violence. He was like killing interns and torturing village members, and it would be not only casually mentioned, but it is like casually mentioned through the main character's perspective. So she's the one that's like, someone's being tortured again. And that just like didn't gel with like who she was as a character, but there also was no work to talk about like how she could accept that so casually. And because this man wasn't developed as a character, like there was absolutely no reason that the reader can see for her to be attracted to him. What that ultimately says is that she is attracted to the violence. And so this becomes a book about a woman who is very much attracted to the violence of a man who is doing murder, but like haha cozy funny. And that like mixing of tones and messages I just found completely insufferable. This was also like not very well written. It was not very well edited, which has been par for the course of everything that has come out of Red Tower, just incredibly under-edited work. And honestly, every time I think about this book, it's just like a bubbling up of anger at the fact that I read this for hundreds of pages and suffered through barely any plot, only for this to leave you on a cliffhanger and go, it's a series. How dare you? How dare you give a cliffhanger on something with no plot? And number 7 is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Now, I went back and forth on Serpent in the Wings of Night, Assistant to the Villain, and Fourth Wing in terms of like the ordering of that and whether Assistant to the Villain was worse than Fourth Wing, like that one in particular. But the reason that I ended up going with Fourth Wing as worse is because the other, I think all of the other entries in this list are not only bad, they have some other element of something that I think is probably more actively problematic. And I think that Fourth Wing falls under that category. To be clear, Assistant to the Villain did have a singular character of color who was like a bitchy woman that was set up as some sort of rival for our main character for some reason that is inexplicable, but that is still like a lower grade problematic aspect than what is ultimately in Fourth Wing. And to be really honest and transparent, I also just feel like I've hated Fourth Wing longer, and I've had to deal with so much because of this freaking fandom this year that I feel like that also sank it lower in my feelings. Really, they're like neck and neck in terms of quality of the book. So as I'm ranking this in terms of like my own personal worst, I think Fourth Wing sort of edges out Assistant to the Villain. That said, Fourth Wing is a new adult fantasy about a girl who goes to Dragon Rider Academy and there she comes face to face with the son of a man who her mother, who is a general in this army, killed, and he is set up as a sort of rival for her, and she has to survive Dragon Riding Academy and all of these people who are actively trying to kill her for who she is and what she represents. I guess that's a summary. It doesn't matter. It matters so very little. I hated Fourth Wing pretty passionately, and I went into this book in good faith. I went into it like everybody else, like, what is this book? Where did it come from? Everybody's talking about it. And not only everybody's talking about it, because like Serpent in the Wings of Night, it was like Book Talk was talking about it, and I still became curious. Like Book Talk can still win me over in terms of like being curious to read things that are getting popular there. But Fourth Wing had some of that, and some people, like people I really trust, did. With the reviews were like, this is amazing, 5-star, 5 stars, like 5-star reviews of Fourth Wing were coming out in rapid succession about like what an amazing fantasy this was and how much fun it was, and like those were the reviews ultimately that sold me. And I went into this hype to get a dragon fantasy, a school setting, something where trusted reviewers were saying this was 5 stars. So I went into Fourth Wing out of any book on this list with the highest expectations, and within the first couple of pages, with like pages, I was like, what the hell is this? Bamboozled. I am the first one to always say that even our own measures of quality are subjective. Like even what we learn in school in terms of like what is objectively good when it comes to literature, like those things are so informed by politics and biases and like systems of oppression that like even our objective measures of quality are completely subjective. I'm the first one to acknowledge that. However, if you ask me to get as close as I possibly could to like an objectively badly written book, I would give you Fourth Wing. And I mean that so honestly with you right now. This is a badly written book. From a sentence structure perspective, from the way that she constructed her dialogue, from the way that she world built and fed us information, to the fact that the very central conceit of this book, that you would have a war college where the war college would just kill their cadets in mass. Like, none of this makes sense, and none of this is good. It is a book where you have to not ask a single question in order to make it work, because the moment you think of a single question and you pull on that thread, the entire thing unravels. I found Violet a really insufferable main character, or like, I don't know if that's fair to the character herself, but what I found insufferable is that the book insisted to me that she was like the smartest person who ever was smart in the whole history of ever, especially because every single plot point, like every major plot point in Fourth Wing, relies on people lying to or fooling Violet, or things going completely over her head. Every single major plot point in Fourth Wing is Violet not understanding, Violet completely missing things, people pulling one over on Violet, and then the book is like, she's the smartest girl ever. And I was like, I don't think she is. Especially because as the reader, I felt like I was like 20 light years ahead of Violet, and I was like, my girl. And the thing is that there were times that it wasn't even like me piecing things together. It felt like the book was telling us things, and then Violet would still be like wondering about them pages and pages later. And I'm like, at this point, just listen to, just like connect what's being said. I'm not even asking you to figure anything out, smarty pants. And so that was a really frustrating experience. And I also find that the romance here was so weak. I did not, I don't understand what we were supposed to get out of this, except for at every turn, she just told us how hot this man was. He was so hot. He was so hot. And it was like that kind of thing where it's like, oh, he might be trying to kill me, but gosh, is he hot? That was the entirety of their building of their relationship, was just her thirsting after him while thinking that maybe he was trying to kill her. And then at the same time, he was like constantly going, I'm not trying to kill you. And then she would just like for pages and pages be like, maybe he's trying to kill me. Like he would literally be like, girl, I'm not trying to kill you. And she just kept on with that, but also thinking he was hot. And I swear to you, that was like that was it to their relationship, to the point that we got to 70% of this book and she goes, gosh, I don't know anything about him. And she goes, what's your favorite food? And that's 70%. and that's like not my idea of a really great and super strong romance. And so you pair that with a world that doesn't make any sense and that isn't well built out, and a plot that like goes hand in hand with that in terms of like, why is any of this happening? Like I just, like, why are they on an American Ninja Warrior course that they can't train for? They just throw them on there. And you know, if you don't pass it, you wouldn't have survived war anyway. What? Like, none of the plot makes sense. None of the world makes sense. Violet as a main character does not carry this. The romance does not carry this. There was nothing here that I found enjoyable. I will mention some of the things that I did not enjoy in terms of the representation that it used. First of all, Violet has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but it is unnamed. Rebecca Yarros has as well. So this is like own voices in terms of the disability representation, but I personally found that the disability representation was incredibly lacking. I will link, as I always do, the really great essay by my friend about the toxic perseverance sort of trope and narrative that this employs, and how the entire thing is just like, she just has to keep pushing her body, and she does so successfully. And that narrative, I don't think, is countered enough by the book. In fact, it is often celebrated how much she can deal with pain and withstand pain because of this. And it just felt like the story itself kind of misunderstands what it means to live with a chronic condition, in terms of like, you can't just push your way out of it, especially when it was asking us to think that this person was like falling off the back of her dragon at high speeds repeatedly, and then being caught on her dragon's back repeatedly throughout the day, and then she would just like go ahead and do it again the next day. And there were many opportunities to have like things about like pain management, or like what happens on days that you don't have any spoon. There were so many wasted opportunities as well, and I think that there was a lot of ableism. And some of it was external, some of it was internal, and some of it was challenged, but not enough of the ableism was challenged in order to make me feel good about like the overall messaging of this story. I also really didn't like that we have this thing that is very common in fantasy romance these days, where you have this white main female character and her man of color love interest. And oftentimes this man is written in a way where it's like, is that a man of color? This happened in Fourth Wing. doing, to the point where Rebecca Yarros herself had to go into comments and be like, it is a man of color. And I just didn't super love the way that he fit into the tropes that we often see with these men of color love interests. One, they are often incredibly over-sexualized, like everything they do is over-sexualized, and that is absolutely what happened with Xaden. They're also often like sort of pigeonholed into very violent situations or stereotypes, and for Xaden, there were even some weird ways that he was like kind of pinned into these almost like slave adjacent narratives. He is conscripted into the army and he is forced to serve in order to make up for the fact that his father was like the leader of a rebellion, and he was whipped in punishment for this rebellion and still bears the scars on his back and now has to serve in this army. Like, there were so many weird things that I was like, why'd you want to give this to a man of color? Like, what are we doing here? Then we also had another black character, her best friend, Rhiannon, who's just kind of like the black best friend in terms of her participation in the story, but she's also bisexual, and like her main defining characteristics in terms of being black is best friend and bisexual is promiscuous. And I was like, again, like, why? Number 6 is Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton, and this is a YA fantasy that is sort of like Wild Wild West meets Middle East, and we follow Armani, who is a gunslinger, and she's living with her uncle in a backcountry town, but she finds an opportunity to leave there when she crosses paths with a foreigner. I read this at the beginning of the year for reading the winners in the debut category of the Goodreads Choice Awards project that I did, and I remember having seen this like going around BookTube like very early in my BookTube days, but it never really crossed my radar more than that, so I kind of went into it not really knowing what to expect. The opening chapters were pretty gripping. Like, it opened in a way where I was like, okay, like I was hopeful for what was to come, but all of that goodwill is very quickly squandered by a couple of things. One is some really weird pacing. We kept like fast forwarding and slowing down in terms of what the story was actually showing us. Like, these two characters go on the run and then we just skip 6 weeks and we're like, you know, they were traveling, and it was like the 6 weeks at the beginning of their relationship where you would have been like forming that, and then sometimes we would like languish and sometimes we would fast forward and then some action would pick up and I'd be like, whoa, where are we? So the pacing overall was just really uneven, and it created an unpleasant reading experience. I also found that a lot of like the dialogue and the situations, especially like in terms of the romance between these two, the way that they described each other and feelings was often incredibly cheesy, and a lot of like the plot elements I thought were also a little like cheesy. For instance, like she's got special colored eyes, and like her having special colored eyes is really important, but also whenever she went to disguise herself, she would cover her whole face and leave her special colored eyes. And then people would be like, hey, you with the special eyes, I saw you. And she'd be like, foiled again. So there are so many like silly things like that. Don't tell me it's because it's YA, because let's like appreciate the intelligence of children more than that. It's just like silly things that were not all the way thought through. And so all of that was just kind of creating a sort of mid reading experience. But the thing that like brought this all the way down for me, it ultimately takes every negative stereotype you've ever heard about the Middle East and it just uses that and infuses the world. It's like, what the concept is actually, what if Wild Wild West with every negative stereotype you've ever heard about the Middle East, this world? And it was incredibly uncomfortable. In addition to that, the story itself was incredibly xenophobic, and some of it was like from the villains were like ill foreigners, but some of it was from the main character. Like, she would just think about how much she did not like foreigners and how bad foreigners were, especially paired with all of the anti sort of Middle Eastern sentiment, just made this really icky. Did not like. Number 5 is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is a young adult or adult, depending on who you ask, science fiction story about a man who works on Mars in the lowest caste of their society. He believes that he is working in order to help terraform Mars, but he later finds out that there are already people living on the surface of Mars who are in the higher castes of society, but they have enslaved his caste in order to maintain their life on Mars. His wife ends up being killed very early on in the book, and that is the motivation that he needs in order to join up with the rebellion. And the way that he goes about this is that he basically gets enrolled in the school that teaches the highest caste of this world how to be fascist dictators. I'm gonna start with the fact that nothing about this plot felt cohesive to me. I think it's really interesting to hear people criticizing Pierce Brown really recently for his thoughts and stances on Palestine, and then hearing people being like, but how are all of these authors who write stories of rebellion and colonization and oppression, how do they have these like pro-oppression thoughts in real life? And like all I have been thinking about this entire time is like, I don't know how like you can read Red Rising and miss that like Pierce Brown had no idea what he was talking about when it comes to oppression. I felt like the entire project of this book was so weak and so like weirdly connected. The like dots that it wanted me to follow to get from fridging of woman must join rebellion. Rebellion means I have to become like part of the system of the fascist dictators, but don't worry, it will make sense in later books. Like that whole progression wasn't very convincing to me, nor was it incredibly interesting to read or enjoyable to read. And this only got worse and worse. Like you start at the fridging of a woman and you're like, Madi, it got worse from there. It did, because the second half of the book, I was just asking myself constantly, why is any of this happening? Why are we killing these people at school? Why are we playing war games? And this book did not have any convincing reasons as to why. You are literally watching them play their little war games, but it felt like the book itself was just like playing this big little war and oppression game that it really didn't have any sort of insight into. There was no depth here. There was no depth to the characters. All of the side characters felt incredibly flat. I was having trouble keeping track of all of them because like there was nothing that was really defining to any of them. There was all of this like misogyny that was like baked into the world that to me didn't even make sense for the world. It wasn't even like misogyny Pierce Brown made up to make sense to this completely separate society that he built. It was just misogyny from our world that he translated over here to be like, hey, this is a cast of genetically modified like superhumans, but also the women are still weaker than men, and like as part of war we rape them. And it was like, why Pierce Brown? And Pierce Brown did not have any answers. I also just didn't enjoy the writing in this. Like his style of telling us the story and building out his world was through a ton of repetition. Like things kept being named, he kept repeating information over and over again. Like every time you turn the page, the main character was like giving another grandiose speech. And there was a way that all of these characters spoke that was like really affected, like on purpose. It was like the cadence of the golds, but it was also really insufferable to read. Imagine reading a book where every time a character opens their mouth, it's like annoying. And that's how I felt about the cadence that Pierce Brown was using for these characters. I did not have a single good time with, like, there was never a moment that I was like, oh, well, that portion was fun or that was neat. Like there was zero of that. I did not have a single good or enjoyable moment reading that book. Number 4 is Vampire Academy by Richelle Mead. This is a story about two best friends. So Lissa is a vampire who needs to be protected from some other bad vampires. And her best friend Rose is like a super special protector person. And they like run away from school, but then they're caught and they're brought back to school. And like Rose has to keep training on how to be a protector. I hated this so much, and I know there are a lot of people who just heard that and you're thinking, oh man, but I loved that book when I was 13, because I've heard that so many times now when I talk about how much I hated this book, and like I hear you, I feel you. But I read this as a 37-year-old woman And, you know, I just had a bad time. I found it incredibly insufferable to be in the main character's head. All of her thoughts I thought were really, really insufferable in a way that is like very 2007, I guess, in terms of like being a little not like other girls and like full of misogyny in terms of how she saw other girls. That whole posture of being not like other girls and the way she approached her own story, I found incredibly annoying. And it makes it worse, the fact that like the burgeoning sort of romance here is between Rose, who thinks she's not like other girls, and her older teacher. There was also like a lot of like weird casual racism, especially as how Rose described herself and other people considered Rose as like this exotic person. So it was all of this like really uncomfortable and dated sort of language and ideas in the head of a character who I found insufferable in the middle of a nothing plot. It was so boring. Like, what even happens in this book, I don't know. Actually, like, the most blessed thing about any of this is that like I've forgotten so much of this, but also I know that's because nothing happened. So, you know, all I can hope for is that soon it will be completely erased from my memory. Like, I can forget that I ever read a single word here. Number 3 is Tangled by Emma Chase. This is an adult romance about a man who meets a woman, is instantly attracted to her, only to find out that she is actually his new co-worker, and she's also engaged, so she's super off limits, but that does not stop him from sexually harassing her at every turn. And lucky for him, she breaks up with her fiance, and so they hook up, but he's awful, so they break up, and then he kind of bullies her into taking him back again. The end. I read this for my project where I read all of the winners of the debut category of the Goodreads Choice Awards. This was the winner of that category in 2013. I'd never heard of this book. I had no idea what to expect, and all that I found was like horror. I was legitimately horrified by my reading experience. We're sitting in the first person narration of this man who is a rampant and flaming misogynist. Like, the entire beginning of the book is just him telling us about how he does not think that women are people do and they're only good for sex, and he's a man's man and he just gets so much sex, but women, and that's the entirety of the narrative. And so then you're like, well, okay, I guess he'll like fall in love and like learn that women are people too, and that will be his arc. But actually what happens is that he doesn't suffer an arc, and he's just like kind of a dick throughout the entire story, but he still gets the girl, and then that's it. That's the entire thing, is that he's awful to women. He meets one woman he likes. He doesn't really suffer any change, but he still gets the woman in the end. And I did not find that enjoyable at all. Number 2 is Pucking Around by Emily Rath. This is an adult romance about a doctor who gets assigned a fellowship working for a new hockey team, an expansion hockey team, only to find out that one of the players is a man that she had a one-night stand with and lost contact with. So there is some sexual tension there, but she's the new doctor, so she really can't do that. And things get even more complicated when she starts developing feelings for the equipment manager and for the goalie as well. So this is like a why choose hockey romance, and I read this as part of a project. This was back when the entire Kiera Lewis thing broke over on TikTok, where she was sexually harassing hockey players as part of her content. And in the middle of me talking about that, I had gone back through Kiera Lewis's content to see like where this all started, and I pinpointed it to her reading Pucking Around and getting really interested in hockey and hockey romances. So it all just made me very curious about like this work, especially because it was a book talk favorite. Like, people really enjoyed it. So I decided I was going to read it, and I honestly am going to be like really transparent right now and tell you I did a full review of this book, and it was very contentious because of like the entire context of how I did that video and like talking about the hockey stuff. And so I like went into this already knowing that I was gonna get backlash for like whatever I said about this book, and it put me in a position where I was trying really hard to give this book more grace than it deserved. I think at the end of the day, I gave it something like 2 stars. And, you know, kind of sitting back from all of that, further removed from everything that happened, and just looking at this in terms of like what it actually was and how it sits in my feelings, the fact that I gave it 2 stars is actually wild to me. It deserves the lowest amount of stars I can give, which is 1. And it also, like, I am like deeply unsettled by what I read in this book. First of all, this book is 756 pages, and there is absolutely no reason for it to be. I don't think this justifies itself in terms of its length. I also feel like there is a huge sort of tone problem here. Like, this is so unserious. This book is so unserious. I will be forever haunted by some of the things that happen in this book. Okay, this woman who is a doctor starts dating multiple of her patients, right? So like at the end, she gets in trouble and loses her job. So there's this like big showdown with like the big boss where she's trying to make a case for why she should get her job back. And she tells this man that she's a double cancer. Like, astrology, and so maybe they shouldn't let cancers into med school, but you know, they let her in and she's a doctor, and now she super cares for her patients, and what can she do? She's a double cancer. That is so deeply unserious. And so, okay, like you can look at that and go, haha, it's a joke, right? But the thing is that like that kind of thing happens over and over again. Like there's all of these like speeches where she's talking about how she's not a normal girl, she's not like other girls, she curses and she wears a septum ring, and she doesn't want 2.5 children in white picket fence because she's not like the other girls, right? And so there's all of these things where it's like, is this a joke to you? There's a scene where one of the main characters is talking about that he used to be kind of homophobic, but then his best friend came out as bisexual, and so he put an ally sticker on his water bottle while going to the gym because he wanted to be on the right side of history. Is that a joke? And the thing is, I honestly, like, I laughed, but I don't think it's a joke, especially because the rest of this book takes itself so damn seriously. Like, we're in the middle of some, like, great declaration of love every chapter and a half. Like, this book just really takes its emotions and its positioning really, really seriously, and then has these deeply unserious moments, and so that created quite the tone problem for me personally. I also really didn't enjoy like any of the relationships that were formed because they all felt really manipulated, and the way that they each get pulled into the relationship, like there was always something there that was just like crossing the border of consent. Like there were so many ways that she was like manipulating these men, or not quite listening to what they were saying, or the way that the men dealt with each other felt that way as well, especially when it came to Maehrer, who was monogamous prior to this point, but it feels like he's almost like pulled and dragged into this dynamic. And every time he expresses a boundary, they just kind of like no Mars. And I was so uncomfortable. In addition to being like just deeply cringe because of that tone problem, I also didn't super love the writing, and Emily Rath abuses dialogue tags. Like, I get it, there are a lot of characters in a dynamic, so when you're having a scene, you're identifying the speaker more often than not. But the way that she said like murmur and growled over and over and over again, it was to the point where like I literally had to like stop and do searches to make sure because there would be like multiple 4 murmurs on a page. I'm like, why is everyone murmuring, please, for the love of God? So this was like pretty badly written. It doesn't earn its pages. The plot itself is deeply unserious. The dynamic between the characters made me personally uncomfortable. I did not like the main character, or the way that the story positions her as like not like other girls, and especially the way it compares her to like all of the other women who want to sleep with hockey players. Like, she's special, and she's like, I guess, in it for the right reason. She's a doctor. She just wants to sleep with her patients, and that's fine. But all these other puck bunnies, bleh, like they want sex, dirty, and like that positioning was wild to me. This was like oddly homophobic for a story that featured a relationship between two men, and that made me uncomfortable. There was like nothing good here, and I can't believe that I read all 756 pages of this. And the number one worst book that I read in 2023 is Darkness Embraced by Tillie. This is an adult romance book about a man who is the heir to the Triple K clan in Texas, because Tillie thinks that the Triple K is something you can inherit, and he ends up meeting a woman when he is in Mexico dealing with a Mexican cartel, and he falls in love with her, and he loses contact with her and ends up leaving the clan. And then they're thrown back together. This book came to the attention of the book community, I think primarily either on Twitter or on Book Talk, because it is a Triple K clan romance. Tillie is a fairly well-known romance author. A Thousand Boy Kisses is one of her books that is incredibly popular, and this book is one in a pretty long-running series that has been out for a number of years, but somebody came across it and was like, did we know that Tillie was writing clan romances? And so that kind of took off, and there were a lot of people defending Tillie, despite the fact that Cole herself made something of an apology and took all of the books down. In this, a lot of Cole fans were also saying, you guys are misrepresenting what the book is about. It is not a clan romance. Like, he leaves the clan, and so like calling it a clan romance or saying that it romanticized the clan is inaccurate. And of course, when I hear something like that, and because one of the things you guys know that I'm super interested in talking about is race and representation in media, I was like, well, let me check it out. And so I read this. It is probably worse than you could have imagined, because like we're all thinking, you hear that, and of course, like you're thinking this is terrible because it is a clan romance, it's romanticizing the clan, but like it is that, and we will talk about why. It is also just terribly written. Like, this was a horrible book to read the words of, and like the actual content, the romance, the interactions, the dialogue, all of that was really poor quality. So this was the kind of book that had the audacity to be incredibly like racist and bigoted and problematic, and also bad. Like, pick a struggle here? No, this book did not pick a struggle. It was both. Now, on like this is a clan romance side of it, there are like two major things that are happening here. One is like the representation of the Mexican main character and like Mexican people as a whole, putting her in this role of like a cartel princess, and everything about the way that she portrayed is highly stereotyped. So you have like bad representation of a Mexican character and something really heavily relying on sort of these Mexican stereotypes. And then you have like the portion of this that is like harmful to anybody that has been harmed by the clan, specifically in the South, in Texas. So like the Latina community as a whole, Black people, the idea that you look at a clan and see a sandbox to like play out a little romance in, to me is a red flag already. Now, our main character has left the clan, right? And like part of what he's doing is making amends by trying to destabilize the clan and like, I don't know, fight with them at every turn. And so that's what he's doing when we meet this guy. But like the primary portion of the romance of this happens in flashbacks. And these two people fall in love while he is a clan member. He goes as a full clan member to Mexico, and she's like, he's the one. And a lot of like the sex scenes and the way that this is written is like from his perspective, like deep in his bigotry. And there's a lot of like titillation that is sort of written into like the hatred and the rivalry between these two people, which, to be clear, when we're talking about the clan, what we're talking about is a group of people who literally that's the rivalry. And so to write things about this female character's big Mexican tits and like her skin looking really pretty next to his swastika tattoos, you are romanticizing the clan. And so this is terrible. I was deeply scared by the number of people who were insisting to me that it was not terrible, that this is a story that this British author decided that she wanted to tell, and that there was nothing wrong about how like the blood and the hatred and his like hate symbols turned her on. Like there's nothing wrong with that. In addition, once he's left the clan and he thinks about like everything that he did, all of that is very glossed over. What did he do? What did he do when he was in the clan? What is he talking about? The only thing that he really names is how he used to kill people who tried to leave. No mention of who else he might have killed during that time. Like, it is completely romanticized. That is the definition of romanticizing. It also goes on and on and on about how smart the clan is, like how people think that they're just these backward thinkers and whatnot, but he tells us over and over how well organized and how smart and how they have all of this like training and whatnot. This is the definition of romanticizing, and that is what Tillie Cole did in this horribly written, deeply uncomfortable romance. That little apology aside, I still have too many questions here, and I don't actually think that Cole has taken enough accountability for like the horror that she wrote in this book. And the fact that people tell me that like this is not the first time in this long-running series that happened, and that her fans insist to me, because I read the book and they were like, yeah, you haven't read it. It's like, yes, I did. And then they were like, well, you haven't read the whole series. It makes me genuinely fear what else was in the series before it got taken down. I feel like I got really worked up doing this video. I love all of you guys. I just have very strong emotions. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat in the comments. I don't actually have another 10 to do a second part to this. I have 7 more that were bad enough to make it to a worst of the year list, and that will be up exclusively for my bindery members on mareas.binderybooks.com. If you subscribe, it's $5 a month. You get access to all of my exclusive content, all of my exclusive videos. I already have my bonus best of the year video up, and you'll get my bonus worst of the year video as well, plus tons of other exclusive videos that are only for my bindery members, and access to my Discord, and some very exciting announcements coming up here in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to get in on the ground floor, I would love to have you there, and I super appreciate all of your support. What will you see from me next? Next, I'm going to have my collaboration videos up, so more favorites and least favorites of the year, and then we will be talking about anticipated books of the year as well. Thank you so much for watching this video. And I just like doing my like chirpy outro after I just like had all of these feelings of anger. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon.